It's a week before Christmas, and the United Airlines Boeing 777 is nosediving towards the ocean. The pilots have approximately 10 seconds to pull out of this dive, or else they and 279 other people heading home to spend Christmas with their families will die a very violent and sudden death. As the captain reduced the pitch attitude, he called for the flap setting to be reduced from flaps 20 to flaps 5. The first officer misheard and thought that the captain asked for flaps 15. The real problem here is that flaps 15 is a deviation from the normal departure flow, which normally goes flaps 20 to 5, not 20 to 15, and any deviation should have been reconfirmed with the captain before implementation, suggesting that the first officer may not have known the checklist as well as he should have. He only had 120 flying hours on the Boeing 777, but that is no excuse for not knowing the procedure for one of the most dangerous parts of flying. When the first officer mistakenly selected flaps 15, the captain noticed that the maximum speed indicator, the maximum allowable speed for the current flap setting, moved to a lower value than expected. Meanwhile, the airspeed continued to rapidly increase because the aeroplane was still at maximum thrust. To avoid the plane inevitably going into a flaps overspeed, the captain reduced the engine thrust manually, overriding the auto throttle, and he began to diagnose the flap settings. As he was doing this, he was taking his attention away from flying the plane, which was now 2,000 feet above the water, in low visibility and still in manual control. The captain noticed that the flaps indicator was at 15 degrees instead of the 5 degrees he had asked for. Again, he called for flaps 5, and the first officer finally moved the flap handle into the 5 degrees position. Completely irrelevant to their current situation, the first officer began to query the captain about if his own instrumentation may be erroneous. The captain did not immediately respond, as he was beginning to observe that the aeroplane's pitch attitude was randomly beginning to decrease. The captain requested flaps 1. As the first officer reached for the flaps lever, he noted that the control column was being manually moved forwards. By the time he had finished raising the flaps, the plane had somehow reached a rate of descent of 8,600 feet per minute. The Ground Proximity Warning System, or GPWS, activated, but the captain did not respond for 10 seconds. Once the GPWS activated for the second time, the captain immediately pulled the control column back while reducing thrust. At 748 feet above the water, they broke through the clouds, and the pilots caught a glimpse at how close they came to a certain death. After regaining a positive rate of climb, the captain lowered the nose, retracted the flaps, and engaged the autopilot. The passengers were blissfully unaware as to what just happened, and they were able to land at San Francisco with 0 reported injuries. What I just told you doesn't make any sense. How could confusion over flaps lead to a rapid descent towards the ocean? However, that is the official narrative taken from the final report. The flight crew's failure to manage the aeroplane's vertical flight path, airspeed, and pitch attitude following a miscommunication about the captain's desired flap settings during the initial climb, which seems to put blame on the inexperienced first officer for causing the confusion. But what the final report overlooked is that in the interview after the incident, the first officer mentioned seeing the control columns moving forwards as he was selecting flaps 1, and the only person who had the control columns in his hands capable of controlling the aircraft was the captain. The captain had at least 19 seconds to notice that the plane was descending. Looking at the flight path, the GPWS announced sync rate pull up at 4:50 p.m. at 47 seconds. But the aircraft did not pull up for another 10 seconds. 19 seconds after the two pilots were on the same page about the current flap setting. Regardless of how the final report presents it, Aircraft flaps being in the wrong setting should not lead to 19 seconds of complete situational unawareness, making the official narrative extremely questionable. The following is pure speculation and should not be repeated as a fact. Accusations on Reddit suggest that the captain is known within United Airlines to be not easy to fly with, and that the captain may have become distracted while berating the first officer for his mistake of putting the flaps in the wrong setting. This went on for 19 seconds and led to the captain inadvertently pushing his control column forwards and putting the plane into a dive. This theory would also explain why the captain did not abort the flight and turn around. During the climb, after nearly smacking into the ocean, the plane pulled 2.7 Gs, a lot higher than the 1.3 Gs a normal flight experiences. This could have done damage to the aircraft frame that cannot be easily noticed, putting everyone's lives in danger if the flight continues. But the captain knew that turning the flight around would lead to an investigation where the cockpit voice recorder would be listened to, and there is no excuse for verbally abusing your co-pilot while the plane is rapidly descending towards the sea. So he decided to continue the flight, knowing that the CVR would eventually overwrite the altercation, as cockpit voice recorders only store up to 2 hours of recordings. To put it bluntly, the final report produced by the National Transportation Safety Board was plain awful. They managed to analyse a modern passenger jet falling 1,400 feet within 14 seconds in just 2 pages of uninformative writing. The final report couldn't even get the age of the co-pilots or the names of either pilot, really exposing how much care the government puts into aviation safety. United Airlines seems to have even less care, as apparently anyone who gets on a United Airlines flight should not expect the people responsible for their lives to be trained well enough to know the departure procedure. In fact, this incident was not reported to the government for 2 months because in the United States, airlines are actually expected to self-report incidents. The only reason this gained attention is because someone spotted the unusual flight path on Flight's Radar 24, leading to a social media uproar, forcing United Airlines to come clean. But by then, the cockpit voice recorder and flight data recorder were long overwritten, making meaningful investigation useless as the pilots could just lie about what really happened. United Airlines believed because there was no injuries or damage to the aircraft, there was no need for an investigation, and only reported it for the sake of public relations, making you wonder how many more close calls have gone unreported.